today's lecture, which is on the trial and conviction and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. In some ways, it's one of the most difficult topics that I've chosen to ever speak about. I think it's a subject that everybody here has probably heard something about, and some people are very, very interested in, others are less. The difficulty I find with this is that there are literally 2 or 3 different stories, I could say, as far as the narrative of what occurred, and I probably could get the same amount of people to swear affidavits that their narrative is the one and only truthful narrative. So therefore, I certainly make no claim that what I'm going to say is the absolute and only truth, but nevertheless, I'll do the best I can with the research that I've done. Julius was born on May 12th, 1918, and Ethel, who was almost 3 years older, was born on September 25th, 1915. Both were born in Manhattan, American-born. They were both children of European immigrants who came to this country during the mass immigration of Jews, probably the largest exodus of Jews in our history from 1880 to 1920, when about 2 million Jews were admitted here until the United States tightened its immigration policies, almost all from Russia, from the Pale of Settlement from Eastern Europe. Even though Julius was born in Washington Heights, he soon moved to the Lower East Side. That's where Ethel was born. Growing up in the 20s and the 30s, they become 20, 21 in 1930-35. First of all, it's important to understand what was going on at the time in the United States. As one of the people who were at City College in the 1930s, where Julius attended, as he put it in one of the interviews, one of their former classmates, that when people talk about what was going on at Berkeley in California in the 1960s, it was child's play compared to the feelings of activism and restlessness which was going on at City College of New York, CCNY, in the 1930s. The 1930s is a time which is difficult for us to imagine ourselves, and frankly, without understanding the milieu which the Rosenbergs grew up in, it's really impossible to understand their story whatsoever. The 1930s was a time in the middle of the Depression. The United States was going through a terrible depression. One of their friends, cohorts during that time, said you literally had to be dead from the neck down if you didn't feel for people. You literally would see people waiting in line for hours for a soup kitchen to open. At that point, any sort of tenant protection rights were non-existent. The landlords would routinely, physically remove people's possessions, and you'd see people's couches and beds and mattresses and chairs and table being thrown out onto the street in the Lower East Side if they couldn't pay their rent. The country was in the grips of a terrible depression. Even during the 2008-2009 session here, pales comparison to what was going on in the 1930s as far as people's poverty. There was a feeling that capitalism was failing. Capitalism as an economic system was failing. The idea of a new system, communism, socialism, Bundism, workers of the world unite, a place where all workers had a hot meal, he had a place to live, was an extremely tempting and extremely very exciting idea, especially if you were Jewish. If you were Jewish, you probably, number one, came from parents who had experienced certainly anti-Semitism in Europe, which is why your parents emigrated to this country. And even more than that, there was blatant anti-Semitism going on much more in the United States than anything we can actually imagine now, 80, 90 years later. To give you a couple of examples, I think right now I checked New York City, something like 8.5 million people. Out of those 8.5 million people, something like 1.4 or 1.5 or something are Jews. 1945, which was probably the highest percentage of New York City, had about 7.5 million people, and over 2.5 of those were Jewish. So it's almost 1 in every 3rd person in New York City was Jewish, but people were much more openly anti-Semitic as far as how they viewed people. Certainly African Americans were obviously second-class citizens of that time. Jewish people also, there were quotas on Jews in universities. There were still clubs which forbid Jewish people from admittance. And therefore, both Julius and Ethel grew up at a time where economically America looked anything but a wonderful place, a place of freedom, a place of the American dream. It looked anything but that. What did look good was communism. And honestly, both of them joined what was called the Young Communist League of the USA, and both of them eventually became active members of the Communist Party. It had about 75,000 card-carrying members at the time, and you also had young travelers, sympathizers, who maybe weren't card-carrying members, but they were definitely sympathizers with communist ideology. And there were public speeches promoting that Russia was, or the USSR was a utopian place. Dream, actually, people had of eventually moving there, but more so was perhaps the idea of transforming America from a capitalistic type of country into a socialist or communist type of country. I say this because I don't want to be judgmental. I still remember growing up in school in the 1960s, the worst thing you could call someone, oh, you must be a commie. Like a commie was, that was like the worst insult you could tell a person. The fear of communism and the fear that communism would take over and the hatred of communism because of the popularity of it were both true facts of life. I don't want to become Freudian here, but it seems in doing the research that many Jews adopted communism, became, if I can give an analogy which I think would resonate with this audience, their dedication to communism was as enthusiastic as many Baalei Teshuvah's nowadays enthusiasm for Judaism is. The Jews became sort of uber-communists in adopting it almost as a religion. So Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they met in 1936. They married in 1939. They had 2 sons together. Michael was born in 1943. Robert, who I had the privilege of interviewing for this lecture, he was born in 1947. At least outwardly, financially, they were actually doing better. They moved into Knickerbocker Village, which I think is it's Manhattan, somewhere between the Brooklyn and the Manhattan Bridge, as opposed to Cold Water Flats of the Lower East Side. He actually did better. He had a job in the Army Signal Corps engineering laboratories at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and he worked there as an engineer inspector in 1945. Ethel, when she was younger, she actually had aspirations to be an opera singer. She had a beautiful voice. After the children were born, she had back problems. Obviously, she was a stay-at-home mother. But as I mentioned, that they were communists, and it's not to say that all communists at the time were traitors or were spies for the Soviet Union. The belief in the value system of communism didn't necessarily obviously translate into 75,000 or more Soviet spies in the United States. On the other hand, though, there were a lot of spies, and Joe McCarthy, who just right around that time in the early 1950s was getting going with his McCarthyism, he actually was correct in his identification of the forest. He was right that there was a forest, meaning that there were many, many trees, a lot of Soviet infiltrators, which were actually had very close ties to the government. Alger Hiss and others, subordinates of FDR for sure. Many of them had communist leanings, if not outright spies. But of course he was wrong in the trees, McCarthy, in that he just shot from the hip.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
answer to a
question which invades his, absolutely invades
They
his.
refuse to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and everything else to the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away from the stand.
For Americanism for many years, and I shall
stand away from the stand.
Fight for the Bill of Rights, which you are trying to
take
destroy.
This man away from the stand.
Unfortunately, even though maybe he was right on a lot of people, he was probably wrong on just as many people, and he ruined their life. So he had sort of like two different forces at work simultaneously in the 1930s or early 40s. Namely, you had people that communism was their belief system, and you had people who were fearful of communism as taking over America. Now, obviously, things should have changed in 1939-40 when Molotov and Ribbentrop from Germany and Russia, respectively, signed a non-aggression pact. The whole idea of the 30s of the communism was that it fought the fascism of Hitler. You could be very pro-American in the 1930s as being anti-fascist, as Hitler already takes power in the early 30s. Certainly everything was better than the totalitarianism, tyranny of a Hitler. Socialism and even communism, they were the enemies of fascism. It's kind of interesting, though, that afterward, when Ribbentrop and Molotov signed the non-aggression pact, and Germany and Russia, fascinatingly enough, the epitome of communism and the epitome of fascism, become bedfellows, it was kind of more difficult to defend yourself. Our protagonists and people involved said, once you buy into a narrative, after a while, don't bother me with the facts anymore. And somehow the fact that Germany and Russia were allies in 1939 and 1940 didn't seem to necessarily bother anybody. So Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are married, 1939, and honestly, he is already a card-carrying member. In 1940, Julius officially joins the Communist Party. His son, Robert, admitted this to me, and we'll see as we go on. When I was growing up in the 1960s and early 70s, just this whole idea, which honestly still fascinates me. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, like those are your next door neighbors. Like this was my grandmother, Alea Shalom, her name was, Ida Rubin. She grew up reading the Farvitz, the Yiddish paper. She was also a socialist-leaning person. Like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg could have been my grandmother, like the fact that they're electrocuting a woman, and they're so Jewish, and the common belief and the commonly held idea, certainly the way it was projected onto me growing up, not necessarily explicitly, but certainly this was implicitly the understanding was that they were either outright innocent and the government was just overzealous and they were the victims of the Red Scare hysteria, and anti-Semitism, and they certainly were innocent. That was probably the best and more accurate scenario, but even a less accurate scenario, or perhaps maybe they weren't the greatest tzaddikim, maybe. Certainly the death penalty was way, way, way out of proportion and was an example of American anti-Semitism. And if their names would have been Murphy or O'Donnell or Smith or Douglas, so certainly they never would have received the electric chair.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, American patriots, I'm sure I do not come before you tonight as a complete stranger. You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail. We, with American ideals, demand that our government shall be returned to the American people who founded it. If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social, just, white, Gentile-ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union, free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
But certainly in 1940, Julius Rosenberg joins the Communist Party, and honestly, it seems, and as we go on, you'll see why I'm saying what I'm about to say, he was really dyed in the wool, red dyed in the wool, or dyed red in the wool, or dyed in red wool, whichever phrase fits, communist. He was the real thing. He took it hook, line, and sinker, and he really became a fruma, fabrenta communist. He was mamish, he was the real deal. He believed in it, and frankly, he sought out communist people to make contacts to offer his services to the Soviet Union. Now, in this everybody agrees that his first contact was Labor Day 1942. The reason the date is important is because we're all familiar, by that time, Germany had violated the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and in the spring of 1941, Hitler invades Russia, which to this day was, as far as men, the greatest infantry invasion of a country in modern history, as he sent over 3 million German soldiers into Russia, and Stalin was caught totally by surprise. I might add, and I'll add this in at times, Joe Stalin, only second to Hitler as far as a heinous, evil, malicious, devilish fiend, nevertheless, as many people like that, was an extremely, extremely paranoid person. And even though he had spies in Japan, Japan was allied with Germany, he had spies in Japan who actually told him the German operation was called Operation Barbarossa. Even though they told him the time and the date that Operation Barbarossa would begin, he felt that his spies were disloyal and he had them killed. And in doing so, he had a lot of Russian people killed because Hitler made extremely very quick, almost obviously taking Moscow and, of course, Stalingrad, which if it wouldn't have been for the Russian winter, and if it wouldn't have been for, I guess, Hashem Yisbarach's delaying Hitler's assault till June of 41 as opposed to March when his generals advised him, he probably could have taken Stalingrad and then Moscow, and obviously may have been a different world. But the point, at least for the Rosenberg case, is that now Russia and America are allies. In September 1942, now Russia is our ally. Honestly, nobody less than Fiorello LaGuardia, the famous Jewish mayor of New York City. His mother was Jewish, his father was Italian. He even spoke at a pro-Soviet rally in Madison Square Garden to a standing room only crowd that people should donate to the war fund to help the Russians in their fight against fascism. Again, I don't mean this in any way to exonerate or in any way to condone Julius Rosenberg's becoming a spy, but at least one could argue, which some of his advocates do argue, that he was spying for an ally. In fact, his sons, the Maripols, in one of their many defenses of their parents, used to like to compare him to Jonathan Pollard. That Jonathan Pollard, many of us campaigned for his release and for his being unfairly imprisoned in this country because he spied for an ally, and that ally was Israel, no less. So too, they claim that their father, they don't, even if he was involved in espionage activities, it was for an ally. But we'll see that it's probably deeper than that. He's contacted by a name whose name is Yaakov Lev, also a Jew. Unfortunately, most of the actors in our drama will be Jewish. And this Yaakov Lev, who's a Russian handler working out of the Russian consulate in New York, he makes contact with him as well as with Alexander Feklisov. And this Alexander Feklisov just died maybe 7-8 years ago, but before doing so, he also joined the Rosenberg Book Club. There's really no shortage of books on the Rosenbergs, pro, against, whatever you want. So he also threw his hat in the arena. Now, Julius Rosenberg offers his services and becomes a spy. There's no doubt about it. It's interesting to note that in 1945, where after working for the Army Signal Corps of Engineering laboratories in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey for 5 years, suddenly, as somebody put it, there's no end to the disarray and the dysfunctionality of American anti-spy network. But for 5 years he worked there, even though he's a member of the Communist Party from 1940. In 1945, he's discovered suddenly to be a member, and he gets fired, but he immediately gets a job by Emerson Radio, a private company which takes out government contracts, building even more classified material, war material that America's producing. But he not only becomes a spy, he becomes, for instance, you can learn, if you don't mind this analogy, I hope. It's late, it's Tisha B'Av, so if it's a little bit, just try to keep people captivated. But if I could give you a svara, there are a lot of people who have a little mush, a little parable. A lot of people have learned in Esha Torah. A lot of people have been learned in Esha Torah, and they became frum through Esha Torah, and they're very frum. But they come back here and they are married, they become lawyers or social workers or whatever they do. But then some people go to Esha Torah and then they become a term which I never heard of when I grew up, and that's called a kiruv professional. And if you would have told me in 1970 you're a professional kiruv person, I wouldn't, I don't know what you would do exactly. You get close to people, I don't know exactly what you would do, but now obviously it's a profession, it's a beautiful profession. So he not only became a Baal Tshuva to communism, he became a professional kiruv kami. He became a kiruv kami. And he was makarev people to communism. He was not content with just being, he had to spread the faith, spread the word. I don't know if he stood on corners and asking people to shake red flag like Lubavitch shaking the lulav, but he actually did become a kiruv kami. Actively, he went out, Julius Rosenberg, and he was makarev lots of people. I'm going to name every one of them because frankly it's boring. Most of them are Jewish, so it's not so nice. Some of them you may know, Joel Barr and Alfred Surratt. These two people, by the way, both Jews. They got on a plane, made a quick getaway to Paris before the FBI got on their trail. They died not too long ago, one of them. Barr just died maybe 4 or 5 years ago. They set up Russia's versions of Silicon Valley. William Pearl, Morton Sobel, he was makarev a lot of people. But the biggest fish he was makarev, and this was the fish that not only did he get the hook caught in this fish's mouth, but it also got caught in his own mouth, was his own brother-in-law. Ethel Rosenberg had a baby brother. Her maiden name was Greenglass, and she had a baby brother named David Greenglass. And one day, out of the blue, what happened was that he was sort of like a pudgy, not a great guy to go fight in the war, but obviously he was drafted. He had some sort of pencil pusher job, not doing much. But somehow, some way, the way the story's told, they were desperate for machinists, and believe it or not, he gets sent to the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos in New Mexico, which is building the atom bomb. This is a man who had a high school diploma, had failed every course that he took one semester in college. Intelligent, but I'm just saying he wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a physicist, he wasn't a chemist, but he was a machinist. And at Los Alamos, they needed machinists because there were lots of people working on many, many things, and there was tremendous pressure from Roosevelt to get that bomb done. Everybody was working on the bomb. The idea of, I'm the last person to explain an atom bomb, so it wouldn't even try, but suffice for me to tell you the words of the idea of fusion and breaking atoms and all that stuff which kills lots and lots of people was known all over the world, but it was just a matter of putting it together. And the Germans, by the way, the Germans probably could have got there if it wouldn't have been, thankfully, for the fact that by 44, they realized that they were really on the defensive, and therefore most of their scientists left the atom project, worked on other projects. By the way, in all honesty, that was actually sad for us meaning us as Jews. Why? Because America actually diverted, beginning in 1943 already, almost all its major scientists to work on the Manhattan Project and its different locations to build that atom bomb. And therefore, conventional weaponry was actually not being progressed. Germany, by 44, actually did the opposite shift. They took all their scientists away from the atom bomb production because they actually realized that they, at this point, had to fight a defensive war, and they put more effort into conventional weaponry to keep on killing, but that actually probably extended the war, experts think, by maybe 6 months to a year. That meant that probably all of Hungarian Jewry, remember, Eichmann Yamach Shmoy V'Zichroi does not start executing Hungarian Jews until 19 44, towards the end of 44 does he start. And it's very possible the year, as opposed to VE Day being May 8th, 1945, perhaps it could have been May 8th, 1944, which would have saved the 800,000 Hungarian Jews who died in Auschwitz. So Rosenberg is working now at Emerson Radio. He finds out that his brother-in-law, Ethel's younger kid brother, David Greenglass, was working at Los Alamos. He can't believe his good luck. His brother-in-law is working at Los Alamos. Great. Now, David's wife, Ruth Greenglass, is in New York, and Ethel and Julius are in New York. And David's all by himself at Los Alamos. So Julius and Ethel tell Ruth, go to Los Alamos, say you can't be apart from your husband, go over there, you're allowed to live there, you're a wife. Obviously, Julius or Ethel or anybody else couldn't one day show up in Los Alamos, knock on the door and say, I'm here to pick up some secret material, do you have any? But the wife certainly would make sense that she would want to move to her husband. And indeed, she does. She moves to Albuquerque, New Mexico. In 1944, she moves there. Now, Ruth and David are also commies. I don't think they're card-carrying commies, but they're commies. Like I said, a lot of the Lower East Side were either communist, card-carrying, communist sympathizers. So if you were Jewish and living on the Lower East Side in the 1930s, it was probably, the odds are you were at worst or at best a communist sympathizer. So it really didn't take much convincing for Ruth to fly out to Albuquerque, and she would eventually then be there in New Mexico, and he was able to visit her when he had furloughs. At that time, Julius told Ruth, and this was, again, this was a famous part, this part probably many people here know about, but as the story goes, when Ruth was about to depart, so Julius took a box of Jell-O, that, dessert stuff that, you know what Jell-O is. And that was the stuff that, by the way, it was kosher based on the fact even had non-kosher gelatin, that the bones were crushed and it was panim chadashis. It was actually one of these quasi-kosher things. But anyway, he took a Jell-O box and he cut it with a scissor, and he gave half to Ruth, who was on her way to New Mexico, and he said, when a carrier comes, and in order to prove he's not a fake, not an FBI informant, an FBI undercover man, you'll say, do you have the siman, do you have the sign? And he will supply to you the half of the other half of the Jell-O box, and you'll put the two pieces together, and voila, you'll know he's the right man. And indeed, so it was. A man named Harry Gold shows up in late 44, early 45, to Albuquerque, knocks on the door of David Greenglass, where he knows he's on furlough there, and supposedly he says, hi, I'm from Julius. Julius sent me. And he goes, yeah, and I have this for you, and he gives him half the Jell-O box, and Ruth then pulls out of her purse the other half of the Jell-O box. They put it together, and that's where he gave his famous sketch that David Greenglass drew of the atom bomb. The atom bomb, there were two different atom bombs. There was a fat boy and a little boy. One was on Hiroshima, one was on Nagasaki, but one of the, I forget which one it was, but he gave him this drawing, which was a picture of the atomic bomb. He gives it over to Harry Gold in 1944, beginning of 45, and he gives it to the Russians. Now, Julius Rosenberg apparently continued passing on stuff to the Russians, but let's skip ahead for a moment. The war ends. We all know that in 1945, in August, I think 5th and 8th, or 4th and 8th, first an atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, where the assumption is that 80 to 100,000 people die within 24 hours, and still Japan didn't get the message, so they dropped another one. The only two they had, by the way, no more left, but Japan didn't know that. Nagasaki, and that even caused more people to die, 100 to 120,000. Finally, after Nagasaki and Hiroshima basically ceased to exist, the good old Emperor Hirohito had a pre-recorded announcement made the night before, because the day the announcement was made, he knew that they would try to kill him, because Japanese have a Masorah that you never give up. And by the way, Americans knew they never would up. Truman, the estimates that were given Truman if he would have to invade the mainland of Japan were between 2 and 4 million American deaths. Japanese women were being trained how to sharpen broomsticks to stab the Americans as they came ashore if they would ever try to land invasion of Japan and Tokyo. So certainly Truman was very, very, FDR was dead already, of course. He dies in April. But in August, Truman was very interested in ending this war with few American casualties as possible, and therefore he just dropped big bombs on Japan, and that did the trick, because finally he had no idea. Japan thought maybe another 5 coming, and that would have been it for the whole country. So that was it. It was great. It was Victory Day. Japan signs an unconditional surrender to the Allies and General MacArthur, and everything is beautiful, and everybody feels great in August of 1945, because we are at the top of the world. There's no country in the world that has this power except us. We, the United States of America, is the only country in the world that has this unbelievable weapon that will scare the daylights out of the rest of the world, and we're safe. Now, the reason it was very important that we're safe is because the day the war ended was the day that Stalin took off his mask and became crazy Joe Stalin again. Meaning, even though technically, by the way, remember, between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, during that 4-day period between August 4th to August 8th, Russia declares war on Japan as well. And that's also, Japan got the message, because they knew the Russians are as mishugoyim as they are, and if when they invade a country, forget it, it's not a fun place anymore. And when the Americans and the Russians were coming from the Russians were coming from the east and the Americans were coming from the west, all the Germans were running towards the Americans to surrender for the Germans, because they knew you don't surrender to Russians. They don't take prisoners alive. So anyway, that was it. So Russia, the minute the war ended, began to take over the world. That's what Joe Stalin's plan was. All the countries that he pushed Germany out of, Poland, person from Vilnius here, Lithuania, Latvia, all of the Eastern Bloc countries, Joe Stalin owned. And that was it. This was going to be the great new Russian Empire. The USSR is going to take over the world. In fact, General George Patton, the rabid anti-Semite, he was gung-ho, begging Eisenhower and Truman to invade Russia immediately. Immediately, Eisenhower had to remove him from his position because he was so gung-ho. But in hindsight, notwithstanding his anti-Semitism, he was right, because frankly, Stalin did keep all the Eastern Bloc countries under his grip. And as Winston Churchill coined the expression, which stuck in the annals of history, an iron curtain has descended from heaven dividing East and West, and that was true. All the countries, Czechoslovakia, all these countries became either part of the USSR totally, or Russian satellite countries, puppet governments. It was a big fear, and in the Far East. Remember, Japan had actually occupied Korea, and part of the deal to end the war, Stalin wanted half of Korea, and they gave him half of Korea. North Korea became also a Soviet vassal state. South Korea was under the United States. But basically, the Red Scare was a real scare. I mean, he owned a good chunk of Europe. He had influence in a good chunk of the Far East. And what's going to go on in America? So after 1945, honestly, if you were still spying for the Soviet Union, you're a Baal Tshuva for the cause. You're not doing it anymore because they're their allies. After 1945, Soviet Russia and the United States is not only not allies, they're at war. It's called a Cold War. Thank God it never became a hot war. But everybody thought for sure that there was going to be a war. And the only thing which precluded Stalin from making a war was that we had the big bomb. As long as we had that big bomb, we were okay. We were okay. We felt good. We got the bomb, so we're okay. 1949, all of a sudden, American radioactive detectors over Washington, D.C. detect a high amount of radiation coming from somewhere in Russia. And obviously it was high, it didn't kill anybody, but over Washington, D.C. was detected a cloud of radioactive dust. And American pilots with scanning devices reported back to Mr. Truman that indeed, there's no doubt about it, that the Soviet Union has dropped the atom bomb.
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia has created an atomic explosion sends reporters racing for Flushing Meadow, where Russia's Vyshinsky arrives to address the United Nations.
Mr. Vyshinsky, have you got any statement about President Truman's statement on the atomic bomb? Please, excuse me. Does Russia have the atomic bomb?
And that was true. The atom bomb was appropriately called Joe 1, Joe after Joe Stalin. Joe 1 was exploded over somewhere in Siberia in August 29th, 1949. Whoa, that's a big game changer. Because now Joe Stalin, he's got the bomb, and this changes the whole game. Because no longer are we the kingpins now, and that was it. Once again, I don't know if anybody here is old enough, I may look it, but I'm not, to know what feeling was in 1949, 1950, but there was this scare. I mean, there was this scare going on as to, that there's no doubt that Joe's going to drop the bomb. And actually, the New York Times said most probable spot that he would drop the bomb would be New York City. The most probable place in New York City would be the borough of Manhattan, and the most probable place in the borough of Manhattan would be the most densely populated area, which was the Lower East Side of the borough of Manhattan. Really, there was a huge Red Scare going on. Look magazine published a whole thing of what do you do? How to survive an atomic bomb by the Committee for Civil Defense, a government agency. It said the following: yes, many Japanese bore burn scars from atomic bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But don't worry, not one of those scars has turned into cancer yet. 5 years have passed. Some Japanese men and women could not have children for a while after the bombing, but all of them have since returned to normal and produced healthy children. So therefore, lots of people have little tricks to steady their nerves if you hear a bomb attack. Fall on your stomach, begin to recite jingles or multiplication tables.
You and you and you and you duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends. Duck and cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration. These children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it. First, you have to know what happens when an atomic bomb explodes. You will know when it comes. There is a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. You and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck if you should be in a corridor. You duck and cover tight against the wall this way. Here's Tony going to his Cub Scout meeting. Tony knows the bomb can explode any time of the year, day or night. He is ready for it. Duck and cover.
New York City's teeming millions, prime target for an atomic attack, go about their normal affairs. Suddenly, their daily routine is rudely shattered by the screaming wail of air raid sirens, warning them of a possible enemy onslaught. This first demonstration of an all-out civil defense drill by America's #1 metropolis is a model of preparedness and training. All traffic halts, and pedestrians immediately seek shelter. Drivers and passengers join the throngs, making their orderly ways to safety. The entire drill lasting for only a few minutes, schools have been alerted, and pupils briefed on methods of protection from atomic blasts. With the simulated enemy bombing in progress, the mighty town's heart almost ceases to beat.
Anyway, even if the atomic bomb drops on New York City, at most it would kill 1 in 100 people. People didn't realize that that's about 75,000 people. That there was a real, almost a certainty that the Cold War would become the hot war. Maybe now, not just that Russia has the bomb, it has lots of bombs. Because nobody knew now, we didn't really have any anymore. Because America was trying to produce a hydrogen bomb at that point, which was supposed to be, or is even more powerful, but they didn't have any in storage. And if Russia has maybe 9 or 10 A-bombs, so they could destroy the whole country. Now, the United States was convinced no way these backward people from Russia could have made a bomb on August 29th, 1949, if they didn't steal it. Now, this goes back for 2 reasons. Number 1 was that there was truth, that frankly, that Soviet Union was literally destroyed during World War II. Remember, for every American soldier killed, 50 Russian soldiers were killed. For every 1 American soldier, 50 Russian soldiers. They suffered much more than we did, and it was never such a great producing place anyway. Number 2 is that the Russians have never, I know this is not politically any more correct to say, but it used to be okay to classify people by race, no matter how incorrect, not just politically, but scientifically it may be. For instance, Stephen Ambrose writes in his book, On America, that there's no way in the world America would have ever dropped an A-bomb on Germany, no matter what. Why? Because there's too many people of German descent who live in America. We're proud of our German descent. Just the opposite. The reason in the 1920s, the reason that the immigration quotas were put into effect is because too many non-Germanic, nomadic type people are coming into our country. Too many of these Eastern type people. And Russians were always viewed as Easterners, Eastern type, almost Asians. It was very easy to drop the A-bomb on yellow-skinned Japanese. Japs, second class to white, Caucasian, Germanic. So too, Eisenhower, when he becomes president after Truman, says it explicitly. There's no way this backward country could have produced it without stealing the secrets from us. And therefore, the United States says, we're going to find out who stole the atom bomb. And that's when America and its allies begin to go into high gear to try to find out who was the person who gave the secrets, because there's no doubt for sure that the Russians couldn't have done it. Eventually, they knew they would have got it, but some people thought they would have gotten it 5 years, 10 years, but certainly not by 1949. In February 2nd, 1950, a German by the name of Klaus Fuchs is arrested in Great Britain. Klaus Fuchs has the distinction of being kimat the only goy that we're going to mention today. He's the son of a Lutheran minister, and he was a German who was a communist. And when Hitler took power, being in a fascist state, as Nazi Germany was, and being a communist didn't go together, so he was a great physicist. He ran away to Britain. The United States asked Britain to send its best scientists to Los Alamos to help with the Manhattan Project. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the greatest physicist perhaps who ever lived, Albert Einstein, was never given clearance or nor invited to ever be allowed to participate in the Manhattan Project because of fears of dual allegiance, or at least the fears of that any relatives he had left behind in Germany could possibly used as hostages against him. So he actually never worked on the Manhattan Project. But England sent Karl Fuchs to America, and he works at Los Alamos. On February 2nd, 1950, the United States informs Britain that Klaus Fuchs is a spy. Why? Because in 1946, the United States finally broke the Russian code. The Russians had a very complicated number code system which the United States could not figure out. And only in October, November of 1946, which they called it the Venona Project, Venona began to decrypt secret Russian messages and began to see even the decryption just led to names, not real names. It didn't say, Joe Smith at 14 East Broadway. It said there's a man called Shlomiel, he lives here. So finally, they figured out that this guy, Karl Fuchs, he fit descriptions, and the English arrest him. Being a son of a Lutheran minister, he's a very honest man. He immediately tells all. When he's asked, who in America was your contact? A Russian? No, I never met with any Russians. Who'd you meet with? I met with a nice Yiddle by the name of Harry Gold. So on May 1950, Harry Gold is arrested by the FBI. And Harry Gold, I don't know what the FBI does to you, and I don't want to find out either. It's probably not fun. And on May 22nd, 1950, Harry Gold is Moed al Emes. He admits, he confesses to the FBI, and they said, oh, but you're not the only guy. There must be more people. Who else is in there? Yeah, there's a guy, David Greenglass. Who's David Greenglass? David Greenglass, he's a Yid, and now he lives, I don't know where he is anymore, but I once went to him in Mexico. I gave him half a Jell-O box. He gave me another half a Jell-O box. Then he gives me this thing, and I gave it to the Russians. So at this point, Harry Gold's picture is on every newspaper in the United States that Harry Gold is a Russian spy. And Harry Gold tells him there's a guy, David Greenglass. June 15th, 1950, David Greenglass is about to go to work. And there's a knock on the door, and who's there? Yes, it's good friends, the FBI. We'd like to have a talk with you. And David Greenglass never goes back to Livingston Street, where he lived on the Lower East Side, ever again. And David Greenglass says, he's also again, The FBI obviously has its ways, and it's interesting, by the way, they have something called the good cop, bad cop, but the good cop was actually one of the few Jewish FBI agents. This guy Fentlin, the Jewish FBI guy, he was the good cop guy telling him, oh, you got to tell, and this, and the Kitzer, Greenglass says, so I admit I know 3 more people. Who's that? First is my Rebbitzin, my wife, Ruth. He's a big commie. That's his first thing to say as he indicts his wife. Needless to say, when she found out, she wasn't happy. But we'll get back to that. But more importantly, it's my shvager, my brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, and my sister, Ethel Rosenberg. They're also spies. So now, again, like in everything, makes sense. What the FBI really wants is the core, is getting to the root of the apple, is getting to the core of the issue. So on June 16th, 1950, Julius Rosenberg is interviewed. They allow him to go home. The next day at 7 in the morning, they knock on the door while he's shaving, and they promptly arrest him for conspiracy to commit espionage. And Julius Rosenberg says, I don't know what you're talking about. I never did anything at all. 3 weeks later, August 11th, 1950, the FBI comes for Ethel Rosenberg, and she's arrested as well. And by the way, this guy Harry Gold informed about a third person named Morty Sobel, and Morty Sobel, he was the only guy. He ran away. He ran to Mexico, and in August 1950, the Americans paid a few dollars to some, as Donald Trump would say, bad hombres in Mexico to kidnap Sobel and his family, and they're brought back to Texas and to New York. We have now Ruth Greenglass, David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg, the sister of David, Julius Rosenberg, the brother-in-law, the husband of Ethel, and Morty Sobel. Now what happens is that at this point, the Venona decryption becomes more and more successful and interesting. David Greenglass's actual codename was Shmuel, actually, but Julius Rosenberg's codename is Liberal or Antenna, and he's mentioned at least 26 times, going even up to 1950. Now this is very serious, because now, up until 45, so they could claim they were Jonathan Pollard. We were helping an American ally defeat the fascists. But after 1945, when Russia was our enemy and the Cold War was in full force, was a full freeze, so they had no at all excuse, and it was obviously clear spying, but nevertheless, it stopped there. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they didn't fold. Klaus Fuchs folded, gave the name of Harry Gold. Harry Gold folded, he gave the name of Greenglass. Greenglass folded, he gave the name of Julius and Ethel, but the buck stopped there. Julius and Ethel, like I told you, they were Fabrenta, Fruma, Mamish, Balichuva to the core, rock-hard commies. They refused to say a word. Now here's where things get sticky. There are probably people in the audience who know law better than me. But nowadays at a trial, so the defense attorney is allowed to see the grand jury testimony of the prosecutor's witnesses and compare it to the trial testimony. And I'm jumping ahead. Now in 2018, all the grand jury testimony, because of lawsuits brought by Sam Roberts from the New York Times, who I also had the pleasure of speaking to, and other people, the Freedom of Information Act, all the grand jury testimony has now been released. And we now know that in the grand jury testimony, that David Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass made is that they just testified that David made a sketch of the atom bomb, and if anything, David says he thinks his wife Ruth, she wrote it because he had like chicken scratch handwriting into nice legible English, and they never mention Ethel at all. The trial begins on March 6, 1951. At the trial, the government's two main witnesses are Ruth and David Greenglass. Now, let me just give you the lineup of what we have over here. The chief prosecutor is Irving Sapol. He's a Yid. He's the chief prosecutor. His main assistant is Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn, by the way, afterward would become McCarthy's right-hand man, but more importantly, those of you in the audience should know, or will now know, that Roy Cohn is considered the Rebbe of Donald Trump. Donald Trump considered Roy Cohn his Rebbe. If we have time, we'll discuss Roy Cohn, believe me, and you'll be happy he's not your Rebbe. Roy Cohn is Sapol's assistant. The judge is Irving Kaufman. Irving Kaufman, he's the judge. He lobbied for this case badly when he was at Fordham Law School, the Jesuit College Law School. He was known as Pope Kaufman. He got straight A's in all the Jesuit classes. He really excelled in his religious studies. Three defendants are Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, of course Jewish. Morty Sobel is Jewish. Their defense lawyer, Manny Bloch, Manuel Hirsch Bloch, he's a Yid, he's of course a Jew. And the two main witnesses for the prosecution are Ruth and David Greenglass, the brother and the sister-in-law of the two defendants, and Harry Gold also, good old Harry Gold. Let's have he also testifies for the prosecution. Talk about, a Tisha B'Av story of sinas chinam. I mean, you can't get more sinas chinam than this. We now know in the grand jury's testimony of all three, Ruth Greenglass, Harry Gold, and David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's name never appears. But at the trial, both Ruth Greenglass and David Greenglass, her own brother, testify that Ethel Rosenberg took out her portable Remington typewriter and typed up the notes that were eventually handed over by Julius to Yaakov Lev, Russian Yid, who sent them over to Joe Stalin to help make the bomb. So literally you're talking about Siddhis Achim, you're talking about Siddhis Chidim. They have a brother, David Greenglass, is testifying that his own sister, she is the one, did the typing. They were charged with Section 2 of the U.S. Espionage Act of 1917, Code 32. For Dan Pollock's sake, it's now been changed to U.S. Code 794, if you look it up. Now, good old Joe McCarthy, the Red Scare's in full force, down with commies. We hate commies, don't like Jews too much either. The Korean War has already taken 50,000 lives, and the jury, which is made up of 11 whites and 1 African American, no Jews on the jury, takes 7 hours and 42 minutes to come back with 3 guilty verdicts against both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and Morty Sobel. And at sentencing, Judge Kaufman said the following. Morty Sobel, by the way, got 30 years for espionage because he was minor, but Julius and Ethel, he said the following. I consider your crime worse than murder. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. No one can say that we do not live in constant state of tension. We have evidence of your treachery all around us every day, for the civilian defense activities throughout the nation are aimed at preparing us for an atom bomb attack. I hereby sentence you both to die in the electric chair. So good old Judge Kaufman, he went ahead and convicted them. They were convicted on April 5th, 1951. He did not die in Sing Sing until June of 1953, a little more than 2 years later. Everything I'm telling you, by the way, I know you don't believe me, but I promise you, everything I'm telling you is bekitzer nimrut, is like tips of icebergs. Everything, I'm just giving you really just the bullet points. Because everything I'm telling you is subject to 10 Rashi interpretations and 20 Tosafos interpretations, meaning for the next 2 years, there was a huge campaign for clemency. Now, by this time, by the way, at January 52, I believe Eisenhower is sworn into office.
A wave of excitement sweeps over the crowd, young and old, as the stewardship of the world's greatest democracy changes hands. Eisenhower takes the oath.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help you God. So help me God.
Eisenhower is a Republican, and Truman was a Democrat, obviously. So Truman refused clemency, and if a Democrat refused clemency, so they knew, what chance you have with a Republican. Eisenhower was very little chance. But for the next 2 years plus, there was a huge campaign for clemency. Now, what I meant to say that these were bullet points is that there are Americans to this day. Eisenhower certainly believed it at the time, and there are Americans to this day who believe it. I'm talking about scholars as well, who believe that the campaign was carefully choreographed by Joe Stalin and company. Stalin dies, thank God, I think in April or March of '53. Even though there were protests here in the United States, the main place of protests were in Europe, which generally Europe had much more friendly socialist leanings than in the US. There are others who swear up and down that this was grassroots support, and there's no doubt in the world that these people deserve clemency, and has nothing to do with choreographed USSR propaganda. But some of the famous people, Jean Cocteau, he's supposedly a famous person, Albert Einstein, that of course I heard of, Nobel Prize physical chemist Harold Urey, and even, believe it or not, Pope Pius XII. Thousands of people throughout the world wrote letters to President Dwight D. Eisenhower, including, by the way, the chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, Rav Yitzchock Isaac Halevi Herzog, Zeichet Tzaddik V'Kodesh L'Vracha. He was a very, very, very big tzaddik. There's nothing he would not do to save a Jewish life. He wrote a personal letter to the president. He spoke, by the way, and wrote perfect English. He was born in Dublin, Ireland, and I don't think the president even honored him with a response. He didn't honor the Pope, so I'm sure he didn't honor Lahavdil Rabbi Herzog either. What happened was, though, it backfired, the report for clemency. Now here again, like I said, there's a machloikas hapoiskin. What do I mean? There are those who argue that the Communist Party who organized the clemency was really hoping they would die. The real USSR, all they wanted to get was propaganda and make them martyrs. They really didn't want them to live. They made believe they were for clemency, but really all along, they wanted them to die. For two reasons they wanted them to die. Number one, they were worth more as martyrs. It would be great propaganda, and it was. It really was. The USSR actually in the world court, America lost. When America took a 35-year-old mother of a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, two boys, and electrocuted her. So honestly, America looked pretty bad. So a lot of people hold that in the USSR, it was a half-hearted attempt for clemency. Finally, the last day, Michael Maripol, the boys were eventually adopted by a family called Maripol, but Michael, at that time Rosenberg, was brought to the White House with a letter. You could see it on YouTube, the old newsreel of him bringing a letter to President Eisenhower. Eisenhower, interesting, not surprisingly though, refused to interfere. What is interesting was that they were supposed to die Thursday, July 18th, 1953. Believe it or not, a very unknown and a person not involved at all, a Nashville lawyer, Fike Farmer, who graduated Yale Law School in 1925, he actually almost changed the course of history. Because on that day, on Thursday, June 18th, 1953, he actually got in to see the longest serving person who ever served on the Supreme Court, Justice Douglas, who was sworn in when he was 40 years old and served for 36 years, the longest serving justice in history, also the most eclectic, and that's a nice way of saying weird, person ever to serve on the Supreme Court. He had like 5 wives and 4 people in between the 5 wives and whatever. He was a strange guy. He never paskined by precedence. He would make up laws as he went on. The other justices hated him. Twice they tried to impeach him off the bench. Never worked. This fellow, Fike Farmer, got to Douglas and told Douglas something which Taka made a lot of sense. He pointed out to Douglas that the law is a law which comes later, dealing with the same inyan. You have to paskin like halacha kebasra. The halacha is like the last law. Even though there was the Espionage Act of 1917, but there was the Atomic Energy Act of 1947, which l'chayra was mavatal l'mafreya, meaning it refuted retroactively, and that law, the Atomic Energy Act law of 1947, had a provision that you could not get the death sentence on it unless a jury sentenced you, and the judge does not have the proviso to sentence you to death. Only on the Espionage Act of 1917 did the judge have such a power. And Douglas said, Taka, this guy, Fike Farmer, has a nakuda. Now what happened was, like I said, nobody liked him. Douglas, he had a stay of execution. Lamaisa Vincent, who was head of the Supreme Court then, he knew this would happen. He was contacted by Roy Cohen, and that was, by the way, June 18th was the last day of session for the Supreme Court. Supreme Court had a nice long summer vacation. Maybe I should get that job. June till October, they get a nice vacation. Vincent called the court back in emergency session for Friday at 12 noon, and by a vote of 6-3, they vacated the verdict of the stay of Douglas and reinstated the execution at Friday at 12 noon. One of the dissenting judges, who at that point only one Yiddish judge was allowed the Jewish seat. Brandeis had it, and then at that point, after Brandeis, Felix Frankfurter had it. 3 Jews. And if Obama would have had his way and Garland would have been 4 Jews on the Supreme Court. But at that point, you only had 1 Yid on the court. That was Frankfurter. Frankfurter said that there was no discussion. Everybody came in, they voted without even hearing the case. He was very upset. He actually agreed with Douglas that they should at least hear. But Lamaisa, what's strange about that is that Emanuel Bloch, he came to argue the case too, and in the middle, Justice Hugo Black said to Bloch, wait, you're arguing against the guy who's trying to help you. And to this day, again, like I said, they don't know Bloch would die of a heart attack 6 months later, so he really was out of the picture very quickly. He dies young in a heart attack at 53. But Lamaisa, it was very strange. That last appeal, a number of reports say that Bloch was actually, if anything, trying to preempt, because this guy, Fike Farmer, seemed to have a nakuda. But either way, the stay of execution was vacated, and they were scheduled to die at 11 p.m. on June 1953. Then somebody called up Bloch and told Bloch, no, 11 o'clock, June 19th is Shabbos Kodesh. June 19th was a Friday. So it's usher to kill a Yid on Shabbos. It's a desecration of the Shabbos. That's a terrible thing to do. It'll be a shanda, and people will accuse you of being a anti-Semit. So Bloch went at 3 o'clock in the afternoon before Kaufman again. And he told Kaufman, hey, Kaufman, this is terrible. You can't kill them on Shabbos. So Kaufman called up Irving Kozlov. He was the chaplain at Sing Sing. His Rebbitzin is still alive. I spoke to her too. She lives in Miami. If Tzvi Lampel is here, it's his cousin. Sharp as a whip at 98. She knew everything. Kaufman called up Kozlov, and he said, is it taka true that you can't do an execution on Shabbos? So Kozlov said, I'll get back to it. This I heard, you won't find in a book. Heard the story from Rav Herschel Schechter maybe 30 years ago, and I heard it now from Rebbitzin Kozlov herself just 3-4 days ago. So what happened was Kozlov was a musbach of YU. He picked up the phone and he called up YU, and he asked to speak, or maybe he was in Boston, wherever, but he called up, he asked to speak to Rav Soloveitchik, and he said, I need like an official chief rabbi thing that the Rosenbergs, you can't kill them. So of course Rav Soloveitchik said, even if for Shah Achas, even for Chai Shah, even if you get them 1 hour more life, you're mechuyev to do it. So Kozlov called Bloch, and Kozlov called Kaufman, and he told them it's also to kill them on Shabbos. Fine. The Maisa, as the story goes, when Rav Soloveitchik came into Yeshir on Monday morning, he was beside himself in grief. Why? Because Kaufman told Bloch, and he told Kozlov, you know what? I'm sensitive to religious issues too. I'm also a Yid. He even said, I went to shul to daven, you should know, to know what to do. And I'm also sensitive. Don't worry. I hear. So they left the court and they were happy. They figured now they'll be pushed off till Motzoi Shabbos. Motzoi Shabbos will figure out no reason. They get back to the office in New York. They hear on the radio, breaking news. The executions have been moved up to 8 p.m. Kaufman tricked them. Itaka wouldn't do the execution on Shabbos. But he called up the B'nai B'rith of America. I don't know how to do that. He could have just looked at an almanac. When was sunset for Friday, June 19th, 1953? He found out sunset in Auswing in Sing Sing prison where they were. It was 8:25. And he said at 8 o'clock, we'll do it chick-chock, and they'll be dead before Shabbos. It'll be good. So that's what he did. They went ahead, and they couldn't find the executioner. He didn't live too close to the FBI. Was sent all points bulletin till they found him. He was escorted. By the way, I want to read. On June 18th, the special session convened with the stated as the Supreme Court of deciding whether to let Douglas stay, stand, or dispose. The rationale for disposing the stay was not to let the execution be delayed for months, while on the appeal on which the stay was moved through lower courts. Just Felix Frankfurter later wrote that he was convinced all minds were made up before we even met. And they vacated the stay on Friday, June 19th at exactly noon.
Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you. 4 times today, Adams Prize Julius and Ethel Rosenberg appealed their sentence of death, and 4 times they were unsuccessful. They will be executed tonight, probably within the next half hour, the first husband and wife to die in the electric chair.
So they had a rush. They had to get the executioner there, and they told them, they came into their cell at 7 o'clock. They said, normally you get a last meal. Sorry, no last meal for you today. You're going to die at 8 o'clock. And they let them be together from 7:20 to 7:50, not even touching, just a mesh, with a mesh mechitza between them, steel mesh mechitza. And they say, when they put their hands on the meshing to say goodbye to each other, there was blood on the steel meshing. Each one pushed it so hard to be with the other. The decision was that Julius would go first. At 8:02, he was given 2,500 electric shock. He died at 8:04. At 8:11, they brought in Ethel. She was a very petite woman. She was like 5'1". They gave her the 2,500 electric shock. She didn't die. The doctor put the stethoscope. She was still alive, and they had to do it again. By this time, it was already Shabbos, but it didn't matter. They gave her the second shot, and the reporter, one of the famous reporters Bob Considine, he was like the famous Walter Cronkite of his time, he said,
"She died a lot harder. When it appeared that she had received enough electricity to kill an ordinary person and had received the exact amount that had killed her husband, the doctors went over and pulled down the cheap prison dress, a little dark green printed job, and placed the I can't say it. Placed the stethoscopes to her and then looked around and looked at each other rather dumbfounded and seemed surprised that she was not dead. Believing she was dead, the attendants had taken off the ghastly strappings and electrodes and the black belts and so forth. And these had to be readjusted again, and she was given more electricity, which started again kind of a ghastly plume of smoke that rose from her head and went up against the skylight overhead. After two more of those jolts, Ethel Rosenberg had met a maker. She'll have a lot of explaining to do, too.
They were buried in Wellwood Cemetery on Sunday in Pine Lawn, New York, on Long Island. And over 10,000 people attended the Levaya. The mainstream Jewish press was very quiet about the whole thing. A, people were scared. B, that they wasn't too organized. C, they were very also frightened at this point. By 53, McCarthy was in full swing, and they didn't want to be called commies. But a Rav did deliver, I found in the Israeli magazine Sha'arim, a Rav did make a Kel Mole on Sunday at that Levaya, and they were buried. But this, unfortunately, doesn't end the story, because the rest of the story is some ways even more fascinating than this part. David Greenglass went to jail for 10 years for his role in the espionage. Marty Sobel went to jail. He was sentenced for 30 years. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were dead. 1975, Robert and Michael Rosenberg, who were raised by a communist family, the Maripols, who were childless in the aftermath of Watergate, the 1970s, and all that, they come out and they say, "We are your sons." They publish a book together, "We Are Your Sons," and they're the first to sue the United States government to release of information of the trial proceedings. And what's released is kind of scary. Number one is that this fellow, Roy Cohn, I never heard of this guy, considering the 45th president. Roy Cohn was a person who lived an alternate lifestyle privately as a male, but was a homophobe. He was a Jew, who was one of the most anti-Semitic people around.
What can you tell us, Roy? What can we watch for as individual citizens?
One thing we have to understand at the outset is that the Communist Party is not a political party. It's a criminal conspiracy. Its object is, as has been established by the verdict of a jury, the overthrow of the government of the United States by force and violence as soon as the right time arrives. In the meantime, plans are being made. That day comes, and the Communist Party's most important work is that of espionage in behalf of the Soviet Union, which means that it infiltrates our government, defense plants, every important place possible in order to steal information from us and give it to the Soviet Union. That has been established by the verdict of some juries in this district during this year.
He loved uber Gentiles, big, hulking, blonde people that looked like Donald Trump. Those were the people who he adored. He met ex parte, meaning outside of session, with Irving Kaufman, and he told Kaufman, which now, when the Sons sued in '75 for the release of records, they found evidence that there were ex parte discussions between Roy Cohn, Irving Sapol, the head prosecutor, Nochayid, and Judge Kaufman that Kaufman would give the death penalty, that they would give him the case only if he wasn't scared at the end to give the death penalty. And they also found many references to the fact that Harry Gold, in his original testimony to the FBI interrogation, never mentioned anything about Jell-O box and never said, Julius sent me. He said in the original wording, Ben sent me, or Joe sent me, or Frank sent me, but he didn't say Julius sent me. But at the trial, somehow he remembered it was Julius sent me. In the 1970s, going into the 80s, there was this huge movement that this was a government whole cabal, part of the mass hysteria that went with McCarthyism. And that was the prevalent attitude going into the 1980s, 90s. 1995, 4.5 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, Baruch Hashem, the United States releases all the Venona documents, all of the decrypted messages from the Russian intelligence for the last 6-7 years. And lo and behold, the people who were the shock the most are Robert and Michael Maripol, because their father's name, Julius Rosenberg, is mentioned in Venona no less than 26 times. And so is Ethel. She's also mentioned. And Ruth is mentioned. And Greenglass is mentioned. And unfortunately, it became clear at that point that even the sons had to admit that their father, at least, was a spy. The evidence was all there in the Venona decryption that Julius Rosenberg was certainly a spy, and they admitted. I spoke to Robert Maripol myself on the phone for an hour and a half, and he told me explicitly that his father was a spy, a full-fledged, fabrenta, really fiery Baal Tshuva to communism. He did believe it. In 1995, that was a blow to them. However, it doesn't end there so quickly. Because in 2004, Ruth Greenglass dies. She's an old lady already. And in 2004, her grand jury testimony is released. This was always the idea that the sons always knew, which was eventually proven actually to be true, that the FBI made a deal with Greenglass. If you testify against your sister and brother-in-law, we won't touch your wife. So they didn't. They never indicted Ruth Greenglass. But even though she testified at the trial that she saw Ethel Rosenberg, her sister-in-law, type the notes of the A-bomb theory, and when she dies in 2004, there is no mention of that at all in her grand jury testimony. But it gets worse. Again, now to the other side. Morty Sobel, remember him? Morty Sobel is still alive. You can go to visit him today if you want. He's in the Hebrew Home for the Aged in Riverdale, New York. He's 102. You can go visit old Morty. Nobody's ever written a biography about this guy. He was released from jail in 1969. LBJ was perhaps involved in having him released, but okay, it's not clear. But he was released from his 30-year sentence from 1950. He was out after 19 years in 1969. From 1969 to 2008, he went all over the world saying how he was wrongfully convicted from this American cabal to prove that he's a communist spy, and Ethel Julius Rosenberg, there was nothing in Venona's nothing in there. And he made money, he gave speeches, made a lot of money. People would pay him thousands to speak. He wrote a book, everything. 2008, in an interview with Sam Roberts from the New York Times, who I also spoke to. Roberts is also a Yid, by the way. Sobel says, yeah, it was hard times then. I think I bet on the wrong horse. I thought the Soviet Union would be some sort of euphoria, some sort of great place, some sort of fantasia, I don't know. And then Roberts said, well, what are you going to tell me now? That you were a spy? You're going to tell me that too, that you were a spy? So shockingly so, Morty Sobel says in 2008, yeah. It's not true. I was a spy. I fooled you all. For 50 years, I fooled you all. I was a spy. And Julius was a spy. And Ethel was a spy. And we would tackle all spies back then, and anybody who was normal was a spy. And we were all fervent in this idea of the Soviet Union. And he, Taka, admitted that he was a spy. So again, everybody had to sort of quickly get to rewrite their narrative. So the Maripols rewrote the narrative that, so what, that Morty was a spy. Okay, so Zion Morty a spy, and Drew a spy. But Ethel, why did our mother die? So that's Taka, that's a good question. Because by Ethel Taka, there's very little evidence. Like I said, the only evidence against Ethel was that she typed the notes. Cubs 2014. Finally, at the age of 92, David Greenglass dies. In an old age home somewhere in New York. By the way, he had changed his name, and he went by a different name. But finally, he dies at the age of 92. And again, my friend Sam Roberts sued the United States government for Freedom of Information Act to release now grand jury testimony of David Greenglass. And Taka, against the wishes of his children who were still alive, it was released. It was released. And when it was released, they saw there explicitly that there's never any mention in his grand jury testimony at all to his sister. The only three people he implicates is himself, his wife Ruth, and his brother-in-law Julius. But never in his original grand jury testimony does he ever say anything about his sister typing the notes. Later on, my friend Sam Roberts went and he asked William Rogers, who was the assistant district attorney to the United States who was involved in the prosecution, and he asked him, he said, let me ask you, it doesn't seem that, she should have got the death penalty. All you had on her was she typed the notes. And the typing of the notes that was made up. There was a show, 60 Minutes 2. It's a spin-off from the original 60 Minutes. In 2001, David Greenglass appeared on the show.
50 years after the trial, 60 Minutes 2 correspondent Bob Simon interviewed David Greenglass.
It's 50 years later, but I'd like to ask you some of the same questions that the defense lawyer asked you when you were on the witness stand.
Yeah.
Did you bear any affection for your sister Ethel?
I did, sure. I did.
Do you now?
Yes, I do. I'm sorry, very sorry that she made such a very bad decision. She should have said, I wasn't a spy, but I heard my husband say it. That would have been fine.
So you hold Ethel responsible for her own death?
Yeah.
For the first time, Greenglass made a startling revelation. He admitted that he had never actually seen his sister Ethel typing his notes. This directly contradicted the key testimony that had led to his sister's conviction.
You have no memory and did not have a memory at the time of Ethel typing up those notes?
I had no memory of that at all. None whatsoever.
So Ethel finally went to the electric chair on the basis of evidence that was false?
False. I think, well, I don't know if it's false or not. I'm not saying it. Don't say that.
No, hang on. You were at the apartment that night and you did not see Ethel type?
As far as I remember, I didn't see her type. I didn't.
If Ethel and Julius were in this room today, what would you say to them?
That they were pretty stupid. They were pretty stupid. They were smart in some ways. They were highly intelligent, but they were real believers.
He appears with a fake beard in public. He admits it on air that he didn't remember. And then after he died, the grand jury testimony is there that he never mentioned it. So basically, Rogers, he admitted that that she was a hostage. William Rogers, who was the Assistant Attorney General, admitted the reason that they tried to bring such charges against Ethel is because they knew that Julius was really a big the Rebbe. Taka was the Rebbe, and they wanted him very badly to talk. But Julius was a Verbrennte communist he wouldn't give up for the cause. And they thought if they held the death penalty over Ethel, so Julius would break or she would break. And the Maisa, William Rogers admitted to Sam Roberts, quote, "She called our bluff." They really killed in that way an innocent woman. She was a communist, but for the most part, she herself, was not a major operator in the whole espionage ring. She was more just a wife. She was killed because she was the wife of Julius Rosenberg, not because she herself was really a criminal. And they hoped that it would work, but she called the bluff and she went to the electric chair. And in fact, even as late as 2003, which was June 19, 2003, 50 years after the execution of Julius and Ethel, the New York Times ran an editorial called "Remembering the Rosenbergs," where they wrote, "Ethel, the mother of two young sons, protested in a last-minute appeal to President Dwight Eisenhower that the nation was proposing the savage destruction of a small, unoffending Jewish family whose guilt is seriously doubted throughout the length and breadth of the civilized world. Since then, Soviet cables released as part of the Venona project show that communist espionage in the United States, long dismissed by the Rosenberg defenders, actually occurred, and that Julius was an atomic spy. But the same cable strongly suggests that Ethel played little or no role. There is no reason to believe either that the Rosenberg passed on secrets so valuable that they should have been blamed for tens of thousands of deaths." The New York Times wrote, amazingly so, "The Rosenberg case still haunts American history, reminding us of the injustice that can be done when a nation gets caught up in hysteria." And unfortunately, that's really what it was. Hashem, perhaps in his own way, has an interesting way of getting even. Roy Cohn, who was the mastermind of the cabal to get Irving Kaufman and Sapol and to make sure to get the death penalty, like I said, he becomes McCarthy's right-hand man after 1954-55, when McCarthy is totally debunked and degraded and disgraced. He moves to New York to be a hotshot lawyer. Some of his clients are all the greats that we're proud of: Donald Trump, New York Yankees owner George Steinbrenner, mafia boss John Gotti, the Archdiocese of New York, all the Gedolei Hador. These were his clients until he was disbarred in 1986 for unethical conduct befitting a lawyer. He died 6 weeks later of AIDS at Lenox Hill Hospital because of his life of whatever. Irving Sapol, the head prosecutor, 20 years later, 1976, is indicted by the same Justice Department that he used to work for steering cases to his son, who's a lawyer. And even though the indictment was able to beat the rap, he never recovered from the disgrace. A U.S. prosecutor that also faced disbarment and indictment. But probably most of all, the person who had the most poetic, revenge against him was Irving Kaufman himself. Irving Kaufman, he lobbied for that case. He wanted that case more than anything, because Irving Kaufman wanted one thing in his life: to sit on the Supreme Court.
Judge Irving Kaufman, after administering a tongue lashing in which he charged them with the indirect death of thousands of men in Korea, he sentenced both Rosenbergs to death in the electric chair and Sobel to 30 years in prison. It is a stern jurist they face in Judge Irving Kaufman.
And when Felix Frankfurter heard that Kaufman said, "I went to shul that day and I realized that after seeking help from God that you were worthy of being killed," Felix Frankfurter said, "I'm mean enough that I'll never let myself die, but he'll never get this Jewish seat on the bench, Kaufman." He was right, Frankfurter, but he didn't have to live so long, because the reality was that just a few years after the death of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, there's no doubt that Kaufman regretted the day he ever sat on that bench. He became best friend with Arthur Sulzberger, the owner and publisher of the New York Times. For 30 years, he begged him. He said, Arthur, when I die, can you please not put in the newspaper on my obit the first paragraph that I was the Rosenberg judge? And finally, Sulzberger said to him, Irving, what do you think I'm going to put in the first paragraph? But Hashem even has more ways. In 1981, as he said, dying of pancreatic cancer, calls started coming into his hospital room. Kaufman, you're dead? He asked his wife. It seems that the ticker, the electronic zipper, news zipper on the Times Square, which gives the news, succinctly wrote prematurely as he still was alive, Rosenberg judge dead. And people called the hospital and asked him, how are you picking up your dead? And he also, unfortunately, he had 3 boys. He buried 2 of them in his lifetime, and his third also is already dead, died just a few years after him. So I don't really think he had much nachas. In contrast, frankly, both Michael and Robert Maripol Rosenberg, notwithstanding their parents being executed, actually both became extremely professional and seemingly well-balanced, very functional human beings. Robert Maripol gave me an hour and a half of his time. And if you're interested, I think on August 11th, he's speaking at a Chabad retreat in Providence, Rhode Island. You can attend. A very nice man. Both him and his brother Michael earned PhD degrees. Michael became a professor of economics, the head of the department of a private college in New England. And Robert, the younger brother, after earning a PhD and becoming a lawyer, opened up the Rosenberg Foundation for Children. I spoke to him, he called it constructive revenge. He said, I channeled my negativity over the death of my mother and my father, where he raises money to give to children whose parents suffered the same fate as his parents, children of parents who are imprisoned, even, I guess, executed, or children of parents who are unable to care for them. He has a 501c3, the Rosenberg Foundation for Children, which he calls constructive revenge. So at the end of the story, I don't know if there are winners or losers, but I was just thinking to myself, I often wondered why, every Tisha B'Av, the Chafetz Chaim Heritage Foundation puts out their wonderful video on Lashon Hara. So this is Rabbi Eisenman's Chafetz Chaim Memorial Lecture, because really this is the story of Lashon Hara. This is one big ball of Lashon Hara, of being a traitor, Megala Sod, of giving out secrets, sheker, of creating and fabricating and exaggerating and devising all types of schemes of brother against sister, of sinis achim, of hatred between siblings, and of Jew versus Jew. And what's unbelievable is that the closing argument that Irving Sapol made to the jury before they deliberated for 7 hours, passing sentence guilty on all counts, was that Ethel Rosenberg sat at the typewriter pounding key after key, pounding her country as this country could be pounded with A-bombs. But the whole event never occurred, as she never typed anything against her country. It was all fabricated. It was all a lie. It was all, unfortunately, one large deceit. I can't think of a better lesson for all of us, how careful we have to be with our speech. It says, Chaim v'hamovis biyad haloshen. Life and death is in the hand of the tongue. How true that is, and how truthful we should try to be. Project Inspire often talks about inspiration on Tisha B'Av. How imagine if the energy, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Morty Sobel, all these people would have devoted it towards true good causes. Torah, Gemilas Chasodim, Tzedakah, Chesed, true Torah causes. Imagine what contribution they could have made with their energy, their vibrancy, their single-mindedness, their passion, their enthusiasm to the cause. If that would have applied towards Torah ideology, how the world could have been, frankly, they could have altered the course of history in a very advantageous way to our people and perhaps to the world. This Tisha B'Av 2018, which we hope will be the last time we have to fast, and that it should now in the future be a day of Simcha and Yontif, strengthening ourselves in the study of the laws and the works of the Chafetz Chaim, putting into practice all of the ideas of Shmiras HaLashon and Chesed, that Be'ez Hashem, we should try to make this world a little better place for all of us. Thank you for listening.